Occasionally, there is talk of Israeli involvement in the JFK assassination. So that's what this video is about. And I'm going to start here with the Yad Kennedy, which is an Israeli memorial to John F. Kennedy. Yad Kennedy, located in the Mate Yehuda region near Jerusalem, is a memorial to John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, who was assassinated in Dallas, Texas in 1963. The 60-foot-high memorial is shaped like the stump of a felled tree, symbolizing a life cut short. Inside is a bronze relief of Kennedy, with an eternal flame burning in the center. It is encircled by 51 concrete columns, one for each of the 50 states in the United States, plus one for Washington, D.C., the United States capital. The emblems of the states and of the District of Columbia are displayed on each of the columns, and the columns are separated by slim panels of glass. The monument measures approximately 250 feet in circumference around its base, and there is space within the memorial for approximately 100 visitors at a time. The monument was built in 1966 with funds donated by American Jewish communities. And the dedication plaque reads, "As an eternal expression of American Israel," well, that's an interesting hyphenation. American is an adjective and Israel is a noun here. American Israel, not American Israeli, but American Israel friendship on the 4th of July, 1966, by the Honorable Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the United States, Herman L. Weissman, President, Jewish National Fund of America, in the presence of the Honorable Levi Eshkol, Prime Minister of the State of Israel, the Honorable Walworth Barbour, U.S. Ambassador to Israel, and the Honorable Yaakov Tzur, World Chairman, KKL. The memorial is associated with the John F. Kennedy Peace Forest, which preceded it. And here are some guys apparently there to plant some trees in the Peace Forest. The site is located 7 miles from downtown Jerusalem, in the same general direction as the Hadassah Medical Center, on top of the highest of the Jerusalem hills at an elevation of 825 meters. The site overlooks what was at the time of the dedication the Jordanian village of Bitar, now a part of Israel's West Bank. The historic site of Betar, famous as the last stronghold of the Jewish revolt led by Simon Bar Kochva against Roman forces in 132 to 135 CE. And I've underlined this bit about the Roman Empire, that is, the Israeli revolt against the Roman Empire, because some people think of the United States as the modern Roman Empire, and might associate an Israeli revolt against Rome with an Israeli revolt against the United States. But that's just a coincidence, so I'll say no more about it. And Yad Kennedy was designed by the Brazilian-born Israeli architect David Resnick, who later won the 1995 Israeli Prize in Architecture, and Ukrainian-born Israeli sculptor Dov Feigen. Feigen created the bust of Kennedy, along with a memorial wall that includes excerpts from a number of Kennedy's speeches. Resnick said that the entire complex is intended to symbolize the vigor of a great man whose life was tragically ended in mid-growth by assassination. So it would seem that the Yad Kennedy does honor John F. Kennedy, the man. However, the fact that it is a tree stump might imply to people of a certain way of thinking that it's honoring the assassination, that is, the man's life cut short, more than it is the man himself. But that would be crazy conspiratorial thinking, bordering on anti-Semitism, so I'll say no more about it. The Yad also reminds me of the stalk of a mushroom cloud from the explosion of a nuclear bomb. But that's just a coincidence. Speaking of nuclear bombs, President John F. Kennedy actively opposed Israel's nuclear program in the early 1960s, viewing it as a major nuclear proliferation risk. Declassified documents reveal Kennedy pressured Israel to allow regular U.S. inspections of the Dimona nuclear facility, particularly in a sharp July 1963 letter to Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, warning that U.S.-Israel relations could be seriously jeopardized otherwise. Kennedy believed that the spread of nuclear weapons to smaller nations, including Israel, increased the risk of global instability and potential intervention by the Soviet Union. From 1961 to 1963, Kennedy pressed for consistent, in-depth inspections of Dimona, which Israel frequently delayed. Kennedy demanded that inspections be regular enough to ensure the facility was not producing weapons-grade plutonium, often suggesting a semi-annual schedule. While Kennedy was committed to Israel's security, his administration was firm on this issue. By late 1963, however, despite the ongoing disagreement, a letter from President Kennedy to Prime Minister Eshkol suggested a slight warming in tone, though the push for oversight continued. Some modern theories speculate that this intense pressure, as noted by researchers, suggests a link to the assassination, though mainstream historians note the policy largely continued under President Lyndon B. Johnson, and there is no strong direct evidence linking Israel to the crime, says the National Security Archive. However, the fact remains that Kennedy opposed Israel developing nuclear weapons, and then he was assassinated, and then Israel developed nuclear weapons. And this is the letter from Kennedy referenced there, the letter of July 1963 from Kennedy to the Prime Minister of Israel, along with some instructions at the end there by Dean Rusk to the American ambassador to Israel. So this is the proposed motivation proposed by crazy people, saying that Israel wanted to get rid of Kennedy because he was trying to prevent them from developing nuclear weapons. So the argument would be that Israel couldn't deal with JFK because he was a man of strong convictions, but that they could deal with LBJ because he was a man of no convictions, even though he did deserve a few. And then there's Jack Ruby, whom, of course, the official story tells us is the man who shot Oswald, even though we can't see the face of that man in any of the films of the shooting.
There is a prisoner. There is Lee Oswald.
Jack Ruby's birth name was Jacob Leon Rubenstein, born on March 25, 1911 in Chicago to Polish Jewish immigrant parents. He legally shortened his surname to Ruby in 1947 after moving to Dallas, stating that Rubenstein was too long and that he was already well known by the shorter name. So Jack Ruby, being Jewish, of course, would be automatically eligible for Israeli citizenship. And Ruby, in his testimony to the Warren Commission, did display an affinity for the Jewish people, as you might expect he would, being Jewish. Talking to Chief Justice Earl Warren, Ruby says, "I want to say this to you. The Jewish people are being exterminated at this moment. Consequently, a whole new form of government is going to take over our country, and I know I won't live to see you another time." And later in his testimony, he said, "All I know is maybe something can be saved, because right now I want to tell you this. I am used as a scapegoat, and there is no greater weapon that you can use to create some falsehood about some of the Jewish faith, especially at the terrible, heinous crimes such as the killing of President Kennedy. Now, maybe something can be saved. It may not be too late. Whatever happens, if our president, Lyndon Johnson, knew the truth from me. But if I'm eliminated, there won't be any way of knowing. Right now, when I leave your presence now, I am the only one that can bring out the truth to our president, who believes in righteousness and justice. But he has been told, I am certain, that I was part of a plot to assassinate the president. And the official storyteller explanation of Ruby's comments is that he was just Meshuggah, which means crazy. This is Hillel Silverman. He was Jack Ruby's rabbi, and by his own account, and the accounts of others, he visited Ruby in his jail cell many times prior to the trial, and he even testified in the trial. And here I'm going to play an audio excerpt of an interview he did with the Sixth Floor Museum. I think it was in 2006 or something like that.
Were you asked to visit Ruby at the jail, or did you take that upon yourself?
That's a good question, Steve. This is a long time ago, and frankly, I don't remember. I have a feeling that I took it upon myself. That though he might have asked, I just don't remember. But I did come a day or two after the episode, and I know he wanted to see a rabbi or his rabbi because he asked me for a Bible. I visited him many times. He asked for a Bible, and he asked for a prayer book, and he wanted somebody to bring him a bit of inspiration and comfort.
So since Silverman was Ruby's only frequent visitor, I think it's possible that Silverman might have influenced Jack Ruby's thinking, or might have coached Jack Ruby to say things. I don't know. I just think it's a possibility. Of course, there is no evidence. And of course, Silverman had not been born a rabbi. He had done other things first. And this is from something called the San Diego Reader. I found it online. I don't know if it's an actual magazine or an online publication. And it says in here, Silverman, the son of a renowned Jewish scholar, went to Yale to play baseball and then to the Jewish Theological Seminary in Manhattan. In the middle of his seminary training, Silverman went to Palestine to study the Talmud. When war broke out in 1947, he joined the Haganah, the Jewish paramilitary group, seeing deadly combat against Arab enemies. A legendary force for Zionism, the Haganah carried out anti-British operations in Palestine, liberated interned immigrants, and sabotaged British bases and radar installations. Silverman still carries the emotional scars as well as the fierce pride of having been present at the explosive birth of Israel. And the Haganah, the defense, was the main Zionist paramilitary organization in British Mandatory Palestine from 1920 to 1948, protecting Jewish settlements and later becoming the core of the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF. Ideologically, it was closely tied to socialist Zionism and labor Zionism, focusing on a defensive strategy until adopting more aggressive tactics against British restrictions on immigrations after World War II. Key aspects of the Haganah. Role in establishing Israel. The Haganah was the primary military force that defended the Jewish community during the 1929 riots and the 1936 to 1939 Arab Revolt, employing a stockade and watchtower strategy to establish new settlements. Following the 1947 UN partition plan, it defended against Arab militias and played a central role in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Relationship with the British Mandatory Authority. While the Haganah often cooperated with the British during World War II, including forming the Jewish Brigade, it launched a campaign of resistance after 1945, including bombing infrastructure and organizing illegal immigration to bypass British quotas. So if they're bombing British infrastructure, they are terrorists. They might call themselves freedom fighters, but you could call them terrorists. And going to the last one, dissolution. Following the Israeli Declaration of Independence, the Haganah was absorbed into the newly created IDF by order of the Provisional Government in May 1948. So Hillel Silverman was an Israeli terrorist present at the birth of the nation of Israel, and he was Jack Ruby's rabbi. He visited Ruby many times in jail, testified at Ruby's trial, and he was a terrorist, or had been a terrorist. So he's not just this kindly little rabbi. He's somebody who participated in terrorist acts to bring about the creation of Israel, and he was proud of that. And I have no doubt that if the Mossad wanted to use him as a contact for some purpose, that they could have, and he probably, almost certainly, knew people in the Mossad anyway, whether they used him or not. And he was Jack Ruby's rabbi. And now I want to get to Samuel Gilbert, who was a friend of Jack Ruby's. And this information comes from this FBI document from September 13th, 1978. Miss Shirley Boggs McCormick Stollard of Richardson, Texas, furnished the following information to Special Agent Udo H. Specht on September 9th, 1978. Miss Stollard stated she wanted to furnish information concerning a Samuel Gilbert, who resided at Dallas, Texas until his death in 1964. She stated that Samuel Gilbert, who was the same approximate age as Jack Ruby, and Jack Ruby were close personal friends. She related that the Gilbert family and the Rubenstein family, Jack Ruby's parents, moved from Poland to the United States together. These families moved to New York and then to Chicago, with Samuel Gilbert and Jack Ruby eventually both living in Dallas, Texas. Ms. Stollard advised that she and her husband first met Samuel Gilbert in 1959 when they rented a house from him at 4140 Lovers Lane, Dallas, Texas. Beginning in 1960, her father, Edgar D. Boggs, and mother, Ruby C. Boggs, moved in with Gilbert at 4344 Avondale and became his live-in housekeepers. The information that she is now providing was related to her by her mother and father, and to some extent sets forth what she personally observed when she visited Gilbert's residence. Jack Ruby came to Gilbert's residence numerous times between 1960 and 1963, and her mother cooked dinner for them on many of those occasions. At one time, Gilbert wanted Jack Ruby to move in with him, but her mother objected because she did not want to take care of another individual. Ms. Stollard related that Gilbert was a somewhat mysterious man who apparently owned quite a large amount of real estate. Gilbert had apparently been an aerial photographer during World War II and was quite proud of his service record. He had a photographic darkroom at his residence that contained numerous aerial photographs. He usually kept the darkroom locked. Gilbert had numerous influential friends, including H.L. Hunt, Dallas oil millionaire, Fred Florence, and Russ Meyer, movie producer. She stated that Gilbert's residence at 4344 Avondale was located 2 houses away from General Edwin Walker's home, located on Turtle Creek Boulevard. She advised that on the night that Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly shot at General Walker, her parents and some of the people in the neighborhood allegedly saw a man running through the alley behind General Walker's house after the shooting. Her parents were not sure, but they thought they saw a man run into Gilbert's driveway, and the possibility exists that this man could have hidden in Gilbert's photographic darkroom. In 1962, Gilbert started talking that people were out to get him, and Gilbert thought the mafia was following him. Gilbert was afraid to go out by himself, and on several occasions paid her father, who was in his 70s at the time, $10 to ride shotgun with him. It was on one of those occasions that Gilbert and her father drove to H.L. Hunt's residence, located at White Rock Lake, Dallas, Texas, to deliver strawberries. Gilbert also mentioned that he had a friend by the name of Ferry in New Orleans. Gilbert went to New Orleans frequently prior to 1963. Ms. Stollard advised that Ferry's name came up in the Jim Garrison investigation. In May 1962, Gilbert also allegedly said he was going to Cuba, in that he was concerned with getting the prisoners out of Cuba after the Bay of Pigs invasion. Ms. Stollard advised that she recalls seeing an Israeli and Cuban passport or visa at Gilbert's residence in May 1962. Gilbert was allegedly very upset when he found out that Jack Ruby had shot Oswald, and when he heard the news, he just about passed out. After that time, Gilbert spent a lot of his time trying to raise money for legal counsel for Jack Ruby, as well as money for jeeps for Cuba. Gilbert apparently lost all of his money within a short period of time after the assassination of President Kennedy. Gilbert was hospitalized sometime during January or February 1964, and he died at the convalescence center located across the street from Baylor Hospital on Gaston Avenue, Dallas, Texas. He allegedly had cut his wrist during the night. She is suspicious of his sudden death since he was an apparently influential man. Only 6 people attended his funeral, a closed casket ceremony, 3 of whom were members of her family. Her mother, who is now in her 80s and has had several strokes, resides at the Brookhaven Nursing Home, Farmers Branch, Texas, believed that Gilbert really did not die and believes that he went to Israel to get away from the people that supposedly were after him. Ms. Stollard stated, as far as she knows, Gilbert was never questioned by any investigators after the assassination of President Kennedy, and even though Gilbert considered Ruby his best friend. Edgar D. Boggs, Ms. Stollard's father, died several years ago. Ms. Stollard is separated from her present husband and currently is part-time English instructor at Richland Community College, Dallas, Texas. As far as I know, none of this was ever investigated in any way other than listening to Shirley here. But, which is interesting, because if he really was a close friend of Jack Ruby's, if this story is true at all, it should have been investigated. I've underlined this thing about her mother believed that Gilbert really did not die and believes that he went to Israel to get away from the people that supposedly were after him. And she had seen an Israeli passport or visa or something prior in this document that's mentioned. This, of course, illustrates this situation where if you're Jewish, you can go to Israel and be a citizen there. It's a dual citizenship kind of thing, even if it may not technically be that exactly. But I find this interesting because I'm very suspicious that Jack Ruby might have done the same thing. That is, I think Jack Ruby's death might have been faked and he might have moved to Israel. He did stand trial and he was convicted and sentenced to death, but then a mistrial was declared and he was going to be tried again. And then he very quickly got sick, apparently, with cancer, and then he died of pulmonary embolism, I believe, they say. But we never see the body. Of course, the shills and idiots will be happy to tell you that Dr. Earl Rose, did an autopsy on Jack Ruby, so he had to be dead, right? Well, Earl Rose happened to be hired for his job as Dallas coroner 5 months before the assassination, and he left that job to go teach in Iowa the year after Jack Ruby's death. So I'm a little suspicious of Earl Rose. I'm suspicious that he might have been a conspiracy hire. He did handle the autopsies also of Lee Harvey Oswald and J.D. Tippit. If you ask Google AI, was Jack Ruby's funeral open casket, it will say yes. Yes, Jack Ruby's casket was opened for a brief period before his funeral. Following his death from pulmonary embolism in 1967, Ruby's body was displayed at the original West Town Memorial Chapel in Chicago. His siblings viewed the body on January 5, 1967, as it lay in a bronze flag-draped casket. He was dressed in a black suit, black tie, white shirt, and traditional Jewish attire, including a talit and a yarmulke. Press access. At the family's request, reporters were allowed to walk by and view the body in the casket before the private services. There are no known public photographs showing Jack Ruby inside his casket. While he did have a viewing where his body was visible, reporters were permitted to view the body specifically to dispel future conspiracy theories that he was still alive. How forward-looking. So, apparently, only the family and some unnamed reporters have seen the dead body of Jack Ruby. This is the closest we have to photography of Jack Ruby's dead body as it's being removed from Parkland Hospital. Allegedly. I don't recognize him there, do you? And this is Jack Ruby's brain, we are told. So apparently the family didn't mind us seeing the brain. They just didn't want us to see his face. Well, I guess it looks like Ruby's brain. Anyway, I think probably they pulled a fast one here, and Ruby didn't die when they said he died, and that he moved to Israel, probably. Just like his close friend Samuel Gilbert apparently did. And another character in the assassination story is Frederick O'Sullivan, another character who has an Israeli connection. It's a long and winding story, the Israeli connection, so if you want to know what I'm talking about, you'll have to go with me down this long and winding road. But anyway, from his Warren Commission testimony, we learned that he was a New Orleans police officer during the summer of 1963, and that was at the time Oswald lived there in 1963, and at the time he was arrested in New Orleans. We find out that he knew Oswald in junior high school. In fact, he had apparently the same homeroom as Oswald. And in one source, he sat next to Oswald, or behind Oswald, in the homeroom. He invited Oswald to join the Civil Air Patrol about when Oswald was about 15 years old. And he knew David Ferry. And this November 27th, 1963 FBI report identifies Frederick O'Sullivan as a detective, intelligence unit, Vice Squad, New Orleans Police Department. In his Warren Commission testimony, he's identified as being in the Vice Squad, but this is the only place to see him as being identified as being in the intelligence unit. I view that as significant because the assassination, I have no doubt, was an intelligence operation, not an intelligence operation of the New Orleans Police Department, but no doubt the intelligence people who were involved in the assassination would have contacts in the New Orleans Police Department, and I think Frederick O'Sullivan was one of those contacts. And down at the bottom it says, O'Sullivan further advised that about 6 or 8 weeks ago he saw an individual in the French Quarter strongly resembling Ruby, Jack Ruby, in the company of Frank Karachi. The FBI did interview Karachi on the same day, apparently. And I'm going to read what I underlined here. Karachi recalled that one night there was a man who ran the Carousel Club in Dallas out in front who wanted to talk to Karachi about hiring some dancers. And this is regarding Janet Conforto, who was Jada. Karachi stated that neither he nor Kano met this individual. And it was apparently Jack Ruby. So if this is true, it means that Karachi was never with Ruby in New Orleans during this time, even though Frederick O'Sullivan says that he saw somebody with Karachi who looked like Ruby. So what this says to me is that O'Sullivan knows that Ruby was in New Orleans at this time, probably because he met with Ruby himself, is my idea. But he says that he saw him with Karachi. He also knows that he had gone to get Jada from Karachi. But O'Sullivan pretends that he saw him with Karachi, even though Karachi says he was never with Ruby. So I think what O'Sullivan is doing here is he's trying to give the information that Ruby was in New Orleans, but he doesn't want to say that I know because I met with him. And he knows that Ruby was there ostensibly to get a dancer, Jada. So he says that he saw Ruby with Karachi, even though Ruby and Karachi never met. And if you follow what I'm saying here, I think he's trying to be the good cop by giving the information to the FBI about Ruby, but he's hiding the fact that he met with Ruby, is what I think. Now, the next little mess I want to clean up was brought to my attention by this document, which comes from the Harold Weisberg archive. It's a letter, I guess, from Harold Weisberg to Louis Ivon. Here is page 13 of the typescript of the testimony. He's talking about O'Sullivan's Warren Commission testimony. It is in the printed version on 8H31. The third paragraph, the second answer, has been edited to eliminate all but the first two lines. This means that all reference to Ferry, David Ferry, as a homosexual has been eliminated. Now, it can be argued that this was done to protect Ferry. It was not done in other cases in New Orleans. It was done by Liebler, Wesley Liebler of the Warren Commission. He also is responsible for those cases where it was not done, as in the documents relating to Bringuier, where a number of men were identified by Bringuier as homosexuals. Such stuff is readily available. Have a case in Oswald in New Orleans where I eliminated the identifications. So what he's saying here is that apparently Liebler has atypically edited the testimony of O'Sullivan to remove this reference to Ferry as a homosexual. But it's atypical. It's because in other cases he didn't do that. Knowing as I do that Liebler knew of Ferry's friendship with Arcache, that he hung around at 544 Camp Street, that the CIA had financed the Cuban Revolutionary Council, and Liebler did know all these things, have his acknowledgement on tape, I think it need not be concluded that he had only the highest of motives in editing the testimony. This is fortified by those other New Orleans testimony changes he made, and of which have knowledge where he undertook to shelter perjury. I suggest that you again think of the spiriting of Philip out of Orleans Parish the night of Ferry's death. So, Weisberg, I think he might be a little confused, I don't know. But anyway, he's suspicious that O'Sullivan took this witness away. At this time, Weisberg was working on the Clay Shaw trial, and the person he's referring to here, Philip, is a witness for that trial. And he apparently thinks that O'Sullivan is working for the cover-up. And this is the testimony he's talking about, the one on top, actual testimony, the original version, before it was edited for publication, where O'Sullivan says, no, Ferry lives, or he did live in Jefferson Parish. We have no authority in Jefferson Parish. I know that Ferry was arrested or accused of some vice while violating some vice laws, I believe having to do with homosexuals, about 2 or 3 years ago, but I don't have any personal knowledge of this. And in the published version, that red boxed area does not appear. So, yes, it does hide the fact that Ferry was involved with homosexuals, but it also hides the fact that O'Sullivan knew that Ferry was a homosexual. That is, according to the actual testimony, O'Sullivan knew by 2 or 3 years ago that David Ferry had been arrested for being involved with homosexuals. Presumably, he would have realized that he was a homosexual, and particularly since he had known David Ferry and he knew other people in the Vice Squad because he was in the Vice Squad, he would know that David Ferry had been arrested for homosexual activities. He would have known that 2 to 3 years ago, prior to his Warren Commission testimony. But we have this FBI interview of O'Sullivan from November 26, 1963, in which he said that he had recently learned that Ferry was a homosexual. And recently doesn't mean 2 to 3 years ago. He's 26 years old at this time, O'Sullivan is, and when you're 26 years old, 2 or 3 years ago isn't recently. Maybe when you're 60 it is, but not when you're 26. So this deletion in O'Sullivan's testimony in the published version contradicts what he told the FBI in November of 1963. That is, he's minimizing his awareness of David Ferry when he talks to the FBI in November of 1963, but in his original testimony to the Warren Commission, he reveals that he knows more about David Ferry. He knew 2 or 3 years ago that David Ferry was a homosexual. So the deletion hides the fact that he was keeping tabs on David Ferry, as naturally he would, since he had known David Ferry from the time he was a teenager. And coincidentally, the FBI report revealing this contradiction was not available to Harold Weisberg at the time he was interested in it. And as this denial letter from the GSA to Weisberg shows, the FBI report of an interview in November 1963 with Frederick O'Sullivan is withheld from research. So Weisberg or any other researcher wouldn't have been able to see why the deletion had been made in the published testimony. It's to hide the fact that O'Sullivan was keeping tabs on David Ferry and knew him apparently much better than he's letting on. So the reason this is suspicious is that it's being covered up how closely O'Sullivan is following David Ferry and Jack Ruby. There'd be no reason to hide this if O'Sullivan was not involved with the conspiracy. And therefore, the fact that they are hiding it means he was involved in the conspiracy. And the last sweep of this mess I'll make comes from another Harold Weisberg document from 1973, a letter of his. O'Sullivan was closer to Ferry than he let on to the commission, or than it wanted to know. One of the secrets Liebler kept secret is that O'Sullivan recruited both Oswald and Vogel into the CIA. He might mean the CAP. Yeah, he means the CAP, not the CIA. He seems to have kidnapped Philip Garachi less than 24 hours after Ferry's death out of Orleans and into Jefferson Parish, aided by Jeff's juvenile officer, Sergeant Bourne. Philip was hidden for a week and sweated. O'Sullivan also lied to the commission in saying that the Vice Squad had nothing to do with the sex case against Ferry, because that was a Jefferson Parish matter. His Vice Squad was involved. There were related Orleans Parish crimes charged and investigated, and I have copies of the reports and statements, not from Garrison. He never even discussed it with me, and his people would do nothing about this strange kidnapping, confirmed by the mother in the presence of the family lawyer and on tape. Ivan said O'Sullivan was too nice a guy. So clearly Harold Weisberg is of the opinion that Frederick O'Sullivan was deeply involved, an insider in this conspiracy. And now getting on to the main event in the O'Sullivan story, as I see it, and that is Oswald's arrest in New Orleans. If my interpretation of this episode is correct, then that means the conspiracy to murder the president had to have had an insider on the New Orleans police force, and that's the role I assign to O'Sullivan. He's the conspiracy's inside guy in the New Orleans police force. Now, this graphic I have on here has some photography of Oswald's arrest. Curiously, we have two different amateur films of Oswald's arrest in New Orleans, before the assassination, of course. And I have two different times on there, 4:15 and 3:15. The official story time of Oswald's arrest is 4:15, but I think it was actually 3:15. This is Oswald's New Orleans arrest report, and coincidentally, the time on there has been altered. I think it originally said 3:15, and it looks like it may have been altered to say 4:15. In any case, it's a very sloppy job, whoever did this, because it's kind of like an ink blot there. And naturally, having become acquainted with police procedure in this case, I sought out alternate sources to determine what the actual time of arrest was. As I said earlier, we just happen to have two amateur films capturing the arrest of Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans in 1963. And this is how they appeared in the Frontline program, Who Was Lee Harvey Oswald?
A movie maker filmed the angry Cubans as they surrounded Oswald.
At that time, I get angry, and I was approaching Oswald, trying to punch him in the face. When he saw that I was approaching and he sensed my intention, he put his arm down and he said to me, "Okay, Carlos, if you want to hit me, hit me." Immediately, I realized that he wanted to appear as a victim, as a martyr.
When one of the Cubans took the pro-Castro leaflets and threw them on the ground, the police arrested Oswald and 8 Cubans for disturbing the peace.
In this program, the two films are presented as if there is only one film, but if we compare a frame of each of the apparent two films here, you can see that there is an obvious quality difference. The color is very different in one and the other, and the official story assures us that there are two films. The official story tells us that one of the films was taken by a Jim Doyle, who was a teenage boy. The FBI does not interview underage people, apparently, but there were 4 other people with Jim Doyle, according to the story, and the FBI did interview them. These are the 4 reports of interviews with these people. These are cookie-cutter reports. That is, sometimes the FBI interviews multiple people, and the reports produced are very similar, and that's because the FBI does not provide quotations, generally, from the witnesses they interview. They just write up the reports in their own words. They're designed as hearsay reports. And anyway, these are such cookie-cutter reports, and in every one of them, the time is given, the time of the incident photographed is given at about 4 o'clock. Exactly the same words in each report. This makes me wonder whether these are real witnesses or not. Not whether they're real people or not, but whether these people actually were there, whether they're actually remembering something, or whether the FBI just wrote this up themselves for their own purposes. But anyway, this source says, the source of the Jim Doyle party, says that the incident, Oswald's arrest, occurred at about 4 o'clock. and that would tend to support the official time, of course, because it's the FBI saying this, really, the official time of 4:15. The other film is credited to a John T. Martin. This is not the same John Martin who took the JFK Assassination film in Dealey Plaza. It's a different John Martin, John T. Martin. This is an FBI report of relating their acquiring of the film in Minneapolis. But apparently the FBI did not interview John Martin. We have no report, so I can't get the time as remembered by John Martin. So regarding the time of the arrest, the primary source document is illegible, and all subsequent documents and evidence says 4:15. But I think the primary source document is the most important, and that one's illegible. The part of the Martin film that captures Oswald's arrest in New Orleans is just one scene of the film. Very curiously, this film starts with a scene of General Walker's house, and all of this is before the assassination. So John T. Martin from Minneapolis went to Dallas and filmed General Walker's house after Oswald allegedly had taken a shot at General Walker. And then, subsequent to that, months later apparently, on the same roll of film, John Martin films Oswald being arrested in New Orleans. And all of this is before Oswald is famous. It's just an incredible coincidence that some guy from Minnesota would just happen to, on the same roll of film General Walker's house and Oswald being arrested in New Orleans. All of this before the assassination. It's not credible that this would happen. So I think that whoever filmed the Martin film, presumably it was Martin, was some kind of an insider or knew some kind of an insider and wanted to film General Walker's house after someone tried to shoot General Walker. And then he was used to film Oswald being arrested in New Orleans because they wanted to prove that it really was Oswald who was arrested there, and I'll get to that. And I think probably the Doyle film was made from the original Martin film that we don't have now, because the cover-up conspiracy wanted to have another source to prove that Oswald had been arrested in New Orleans. And they realized that there was a potential credibility problem with the John T. Martin film. So they wanted the Doyle film too. And the Doyle film is probably a creation after the fact of the cover-up, so that there can be another source to confirm that Oswald is the one who was arrested and to confirm the time of the arrest. So they're not just relying on Martin, who I think is an insider, and they knew that, and they didn't want it to poison their case, their story, if it became discovered that Martin was an insider. I don't think it was ever proven that Martin was an insider of any kind. But I think that the Martin film as we have it is simply not credible, that General Walker's house and Oswald being arrested in New Orleans would all be on the same roll of film before the assassination. So I think something weird developed here, and that both films actually originate with the original Martin film. And here I've put the fingerprint card next to the arrest report. Both of these documents are from the New Orleans arrest. I don't know why apparently there's two sets of fingerprints were taken, because they're definitely not the same set. And if you compare the two, the quality of the images isn't very good, but to me, they don't look like the same fingerprints. But I'm not a fingerprint expert, of course. But these were both allegedly taken of the same person arrested in New Orleans. And I think they're different. They're definitely two different sets of prints, even if they came from the same person. And it's not explained why that would be the case. Also, as I've noted on here, there's a difference in eye color. On the fingerprint card, the eye color is said to be brown, and on the arrest report, it's said to be blue. We know that Lee Harvey Oswald's eyes were blue. The sources all say that. They might say blue-gray or something like that, but it's not brown. But in some instances, Oswald is identified with brown eyes. This being one example here, Aline Mosby, who interviewed Oswald in Moscow when he defected to the Soviet Union, specifically says that he had brown eyes. This is one of the reasons I think that it was Harvey who defected to the Soviet Union, not Lee, and that this is Harvey Oswald has the brown eyes, and Lee has the blue eyes. So I think what this means for what's going on in New Orleans here is that Harvey is the one who was arrested and booked at the police station, not Lee Harvey Oswald. But of course the cover-up wants us to think it was Lee Harvey Oswald because they don't want us to know that Harvey even exists. So I think the evidence was altered imperfectly to make it seem as though Lee Harvey Oswald is the one who was arrested and not Harvey Oswald. And I think there's a reason, and I'll get to that. So what I'm saying here is that for the fingerprint card on the right, this is Harvey's fingerprints and Harvey's brown eyes. And on the left, we have Lee Harvey Oswald's fingerprints and Lee Harvey Oswald's blue eyes. And I just want to give another example here of the eyes of Harvey Oswald. Leonard Hutchison operated a grocery store in Irving, and he claimed that the assassin of President Kennedy, whom he had seen on television, had come into his store earlier and to cash a check. That's why he remembers him, because at that time it was a rather large check, and he remembers the name as being Harvey Oswald. And he doesn't give the eye color, but he says the eyes were dark, and that would be more consistent with brown eyes than blue eyes. So I think this is an instance where Harvey and his wife Marina went to the grocery store, and Harvey had the dark brown eyes and the name Harvey. And getting back to New Orleans here, Oswald, Harvey or Lee, was arrested in the afternoon on one day, either 3:15 or 4:15, and he stayed in jail overnight, and the next day he requested an interview with the FBI, and the FBI agent Quigley, I think it's John Quigley, showed up to interview him, and he reported the eyes as being blue hazel. So what I think this means is that the next day, Lee Harvey Oswald was the one who was in the jail, but the one that had originally been booked and put into jail was Harvey Oswald. So I think a switch was made in the jail, and for this you would need an insider in the New Orleans Police Department, and that's Frederick O'Sullivan. So I think Sullivan cooperated in this ruse here and brought in Lee Harvey Oswald sometime in the interim, probably on the night after Harvey had been arrested, and got Harvey out of there and put Lee in his place. And to round out this affair, I'll bring up this Warren Commission testimony of Lillian Murrett, who is Lee Harvey Oswald's aunt. And this happened on the very day he was arrested. Mrs. Murrett says, they knew I was going to be operated on, and he came up there to see me. She's in the hospital, which I thought was very nice. You mean Lee? Yes, I was at that time at the eye, ear, nose, and throat hospital, and he said, how are you feeling? And I said, all right. He stayed just a couple of minutes, really, and he seemed to be nervous, like, and I thanked him for coming, and then he went off. So I think what's going on here, because Lee is being uncharacteristically kind here. He's an asshole, Lee Harvey Oswald. That's what all the evidence shows. But this is kind of uncharacteristically nice of him. And what he's doing, I think, is proving that he's Lee Harvey Oswald, that he's there in New Orleans on the day he's going to be arrested. And Lillian Murrett would know for sure that that's her nephew. It's not Harvey. So this is Lee Harvey Oswald participating, I believe, in a ruse to give himself an alibi. He starts off the day, this is in the morning, late morning, he visits his aunt, and we know this is Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans. So I think this is an alibi operation, and this is how I think it went down. In the morning, Lee Harvey Oswald visits Lillian Murrett to establish his identity in the witness record. At 3:15 p.m., Harvey is arrested and brought to the police station and fingerprinted and booked. At about 4 p.m., Lee is photographed in John T. Martin film to photographically establish Lee as being arrested. The film does not actually show any arrest. Subsequently, the Doyle film is created from the Martin footage. During the night, Vice Squad Detective Frederick O'Sullivan brings Lee into the jail and lets Harvey out. O'Sullivan subsequently alters some of the police evidence, including photos of Lee, to replace photos of Harvey, but misses the fingerprint card. On the next day, Lee requests an FBI interview to establish his identity and whereabouts by means of the FBI. So if I've got this right, it would give Lee Harvey Oswald an alibi for a period of perhaps 8 to 12 hours. And if arrangements had been made in advance, that would have given Oswald enough time to visit Cuba, to meet with somebody perhaps. And I think this is such an elaborate alibi plan that it probably would have to be something like this. That is, the idea is that I think Oswald is probably doing this as part of the Cuban plot, and the idea is to make it absolutely clear that Oswald is not the person who someone may have seen going to Cuba or being in Cuba at this time, because he was under arrest in the New Orleans jail. And I've got here a graphic from a Hoover memo where Hoover recounts telling RFK that Oswald went to Cuba on several occasions. I believe Oswald had gone to Cuba around Christmas time, 1962. This would be another occasion. Apparently, if Hoover is telling the truth in his memo, there were still other occasions that I don't know about. But if Oswald had gone to Cuba on several occasions, as J. Edgar Hoover says in his own memo here, then this could have been one of those occasions. A flight to Cuba from New Orleans, I don't know how long that would take, maybe a couple of hours, I don't know. But it was certainly 8 to 12 hours would certainly be enough time for him to fly to Cuba and meet with somebody, and then to fly back and get put into the jail. Of course, I can't prove any of that flying or anything at all, really. This is just the way I interpret the evidence. So what, you may ask, does any of this have to do with Israel? And for that, we go to Haaretz, an article in Haaretz, which I downloaded in 2019. The JFK Files, how Oswald's childhood friend found himself in Israel and ended up helping the Mossad. Being called to testify before the Warren Commission on JFK's assassination was only one milestone in the extraordinary life of Frederick O'Sullivan. He also helped foil a plot to assassinate Nixon. Frederick O'Sullivan is Frederick O'Sullivan. And as it says here, one fall, for extra money, he worked helping direct traffic at a local Reform synagogue over Rosh Hashanah. The rabbi asked him if he would come back for Yom Kippur. O'Sullivan said he would if he was allowed to use the synagogue library. By 1967, O'Sullivan had converted to Judaism with that same rabbi. And there's a picture of Sergeant Fred O'Sullivan, commander of something. Presumably that's at the New Orleans Police Department. And somehow he's got a portrait of Trotsky on the wall, apparently, behind him. That's not explained. And also provided here is a photograph of him. And underneath it says, Frederick O'Sullivan, volunteering during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. So apparently Frederick O'Sullivan, at some point, and the exact point is not made clear, though the story I read just before this indicates it would be 1967, at some point he became enamored of Judaism and converted to Judaism, and at some point moved to Israel and helped the Mossad, according to this article, and actually fought in the Yom Kippur War. Maybe that's how he helped the Mossad. I don't know. So the official story has his conversion to Judaism coming after the assassination. But we don't always know everything that's going on, so who knows? He may have been connected to the Mossad at the time of the assassination, or maybe having been a tool in the assassination, and the Mossad being a tool in the assassination, through his connections, he got in good with the Mossad. I don't know how any of that works because I've never been in the intelligence business. So I think Israel probably was involved with the assassination, and I've presented all the evidence that makes me think that here. There is other evidence recently, in the last couple of years anyway. There has been released CIA documents which have been unredacted, which show that the CIA was hiding their relationship with Israel. And that's interesting, but nothing on that bears directly on the JFK assassination, so I didn't try to cover that here. And, well, I guess that's all I have to say on the matter.